He came from a lineage of kings, but carried the weight of history in hands that only knew the roughness of wood. There were no scepters, crowns, or palaces, just the smell of sawdust, the sound of a hammer, and the sweat that streamed down his face. Joseph, the carpenter of Nazareth, was a silent echo of a glorious past that seemed to have been lost to time. The people saw him as just another ordinary man, an honest craftsman, but few knew of the majesty that ran in his veins, a heritage that linked him directly to King David. It was a nobility that manifested not in power, but in character, a humility that set him apart from the others. He was not a leader of a nation, but a guardian of a promise the world did not even suspect. What moved him was a righteousness that came from the soul. Even before Mary entered his life, Joseph was already a just man, and this justice was not a mere legal formality, but a deep compassion. When he learned of Mary's pregnancy, the shock and pain were real, but his first instinct was not to follow the law that called for public exposure and scandal. In his heart, he knew that Mary's dignity was more important than his own public honor. He decided to leave her in secret, protecting her from scorn. Even if it might cost him his own reputation, it was a choice of love and silent faith, an act of nobility that echoed his heritage in a way no one could see except God. Night fell, and with it, a heavy silence that amplified every thought and doubt that afflicted him. Joseph lay down, but sleep would not come, and the dilemma that consumed him was not just about Mary and the honor of his family. It was about his own heart, which wrestled between what the law said and the gentle voice of his conscience that pleaded for mercy. He felt alone, betrayed by circumstances he could not understand, and for a moment, his faith, so solid, seemed to waver under the weight of a mystery he had no way of unraveling. The pillow seemed to burn beneath his head, and the burden of the decision to leave her in secret, while freeing him from public scandal, oppressed him with a sadness he had never felt. Every breath was a silent lament, and exhaustion finally overcame him, more as a physical and emotional collapse than as a refuge. It was in this much-needed yet troubled sleep that reality bent in a way he could never have predicted. It wasn't a common dream. It was a complete immersion in something that was not his, a presence that manifested serenely and powerfully, filling the space. He heard a voice that did not need ears to be understood, a message that was engraved directly on his soul. Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. The words were like a balm for the open wound in his spirit. The confusion dissipated, the pain dissolved, and the lump in his throat untied in a sigh of relief and awe. Suddenly everything made sense, and his sadness was replaced by a sense of reverence and unshakable purpose. The silent man, the humble carpenter, was being called to the most extraordinary mission anyone could receive. When Joseph opened his eyes the next morning, the sun was already high, and the light streaming through the window seemed brighter. The weight of the world he felt the day before had dissipated, replaced by a sense of clarity and peace he had never experienced. The confusion and anguish of the previous night seemed to belong to another life, to a man he no longer was. That dream, or rather that visitation, had not been a fantasy. The certainty of what he heard and felt was as real as the smell of wood in his workshop. He got up and every movement of his body seemed to carry a new purpose. The same objects, the same routine, the same village of Nazareth that had once seemed so insignificant to him, now took on a new meaning. They were the setting for the most important mission humanity could witness. And he, the humble carpenter, was its guardian. Without hesitation, he went to Mary's house. There was no need for grand speeches, elaborate explanations, or justifications for the curious stares of the neighbors. Just the quiet certainty of a man who knew what needed to be done. When his eyes met hers, there were no longer any doubts, just a silent and profound understanding. He took her home, a simple gesture that was worth more than 1,000 words. It was an act of protection, the beginning of his. Work as the invisible shield that the premise brought. From that moment on, Joseph's life ceased to be just his own. It became the solid foundation upon which the divine promise would be built, a responsibility he carried with a dignity and discretion that could not come from anything but unshakable faith. He was ready for the journey, whatever it might be. Life in Nazareth, which had been one of innocent simplicity, now became a stage of whispers and stares. The neighbors, who one day greeted him with smiles, now looked away or stared at him with a curiosity loaded with judgment. Joseph's silence about Mary's pregnancy was interpreted as a tacit confession, a scandal unfolding in broad daylight. And he felt the weight of every look, every whisper. His heart, which was of flesh, felt the pain of misunderstanding and the burden of an honor that had to be sacrificed for the sake of something greater. But he did not defend himself, did not try to explain the inexplicable. Truth was his fortress, and the purpose that now guided him was an impenetrable armor. He knew that the approval of men was insignificant compared to the approval of God, and discretion became his greatest weapon against the judgment of others, a proof of his undeniable humility. Inside the small house, however, a new and serene world was rising. The wood in Joseph's workshop, which had previously only served to sustain the body, was now a means to sustain the promise. The hands that forged planks for tables and chairs were the same ones that, with all care and love, built the cradle of a child who was not his, but whom he loved with all the strength of his soul. The routine was simple and laborious. He worked from sunrise to sunset, and every hammer blow, every flying wood chip was an act of faith. He was the invisible shield that the premise brought, the wall that protected the promise of the Messiah from the chaotic and judgmental world outside. The absence of public miracles or great speeches was, in fact, Joseph's greatest virtue, a man who demonstrated his greatness in silent and constant obedience, in hard work, and in a love that did not need to be said to be felt. That time of peace, though filled with whispers, was interrupted by an order that echoed throughout the empire. The decree of Caesar Augustus, the most powerful man on earth, required everyone to return to their hometown to be registered. For most people, it was an inconvenience, an imperial bureaucracy, but for Joseph, it was another test, another step on a journey that seemed to be dictated by forces greater than himself. His hometown was Bethlehem, the city of King David, his royal ancestry, which, ironically, forced him into a pilgrimage under the yoke of a pagan emperor. And the most distressing thing was Mary's condition, with her pregnancy in an advanced stage. Fear was a silent companion in his heart. The weight of his responsibility was palpable, and he felt the imminent danger in every step. He knew that the journey, already dangerous on its own, became even more risky with God's promise in her womb. They prepared in silence, without a fuss. Joseph packed what they could carry, a few things that represented their entire life, and arranged the donkey with all care, ensuring the mount was as comfortable as possible for Mary. The road was long and winding, and they were not alone. Entire families were moving in the same direction, but Joseph and Mary seemed to be in the private world, a bubble of purpose and intimacy in the middle of the crowd. He walked ahead, with watchful eyes and a mind on guard, like a silent hunting dog protecting its cub. He was the barrier against the cold of the night, against the heat of the day, against the dangers of the road, and against the gaze of the other travelers. Every step of the animal was a silent prayer, a manifestation of his faith, a reverence for the mystery he protected. The man of few words, but of unshakable devotion, was once again proving his greatness in invisibility. The journey was not about him, but about the promise he carried in his heart, in his spirit, and in his life. The arrival in Bethlehem was a shock. Far from the silence and calm that had marked most of the journey, the city was bustling with the agitation of the census. The streets were packed with people, voices mixed in a tiring cacophony, and the smell of sweat and smoke hung in the air. The fatigue of the long journey weighed on his shoulders, but the urgency of finding a place for Mary was the only thought that moved him. At every inn he knocked on, the answer was the same, a dry and definitive no room. The weariness in his eyes deepened, and the anguish in his heart grew. A descendant of kings, a guardian of a promise that would change the destiny of humanity, was there, begging for a simple room. The irony of the situation was brutal, but he would not allow himself to falter. The burden of the mission was heavy, but his faith was his compass. After what seemed like an eternity of rejections, hope began to fade. Mary's body was already showing clear signs that the time was near, and the lack of proper shelter was torture for Joseph's soul. It was then that the last innkeeper, seeing the urgency and silent despair in his eyes, offered the only place left, a stable at the back of the property. It was not a place for human beings, but for animals. The smell of hay and cattle invaded his nostrils. The floor was beaten earth, and the lighting came from a single lamp. But for Joseph, it was the most comforting sight he had seen in a long time. It was a roof, a shelter, a place for the promise to be fulfilled. Without hesitation, he arranged the space, cleaned what he could, and prepared a bed of straw. The man who held the fate of the world in his hands was there, in a place without honor, but with all the dignity of one who knew his greatest mission was to serve. Time inside was different. The cold night settled in, and the sound of the animals was the only melody that lulled the weight. Joseph, his heart tight with anxiety, did everything he could to give Mary some comfort. He arranged the straw, fetched water, and made a small fire to warm her, his movements silent and full of a care that came from the soul. The smell of hay and cattle mixed with the tension in the air, and the only light illuminating the small space came from a faint lamp and the timid light of a fire, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. There were no doctors, no midwives, no great celebrations. It was just him and her, alone in the world, and a silence that, all of a sudden, seemed to carry the weight of all eternity. There, in that dishonorable place, Something was happening that the world could never imagine, and he, the silent guardian, felt every minute of that event. And then the silence was broken. A sound that was not of pain, but of life, echoed through the stable. The cry of a newborn, the most common and most mysterious sound of all. And there, on the straw, in the middle of the darkness and simplicity, was he, God's promise, the Messiah, the King of all creation. Joseph took him in his arms, and the fragility of that small body was a stark contrast to the greatness of its purpose. All the fatigue of the journey, all the pain of the judgmental stairs, all the uncertainty of the path, dissolved in a single sigh of relief and awe. The reverence he felt was not reverence for a dramatic miracle, but for something much deeper, the humility of a God who made himself man in a place with no pomp. The carpenter, the man with calloused hands, was holding the hope of the world. Joseph's life, which seemed to have reached a climax, was now just beginning, and his greatest responsibility was to be the father of a God on earth. The night that followed the birth was of a surreal, almost palpable peace. The silence seemed to be charged with an energy that spread beyond the stable. Walls, but it was suddenly broken by the sound of hurried footsteps. They were the footsteps of simple men, sweaty and with the smell of the fields, footsteps that approached with an urgency that could not be explained. Joseph, exhausted but with a vigilance that never abandoned him, stood up, ready for whatever came. He watched the men, with rough faces and calloused hands, enter the cave. They were shepherds, men who lived on the margins of society, but who had in their eyes a gleam of reverence and awe that did not match their appearance. And they approached, not with fear, but with a humility that seemed to echo that of the place. The shepherds told their story, a story as fantastic as Joseph's, and he listened to every word with the attention that came from the soul. They spoke of an angel who appeared in the darkness of the night, of a celestial choir that filled the sky with a song of peace and glory, and of a divine order that guided them to that place. Joseph, who until then had kept his secret, felt a wave of emotion. His faith, which had been tested in the silence of his heart, was now confirmed by the account of men he barely knew. He was not the only one who knew. Heaven was, in fact, communicating with the humble. There, in that improvised space, the mystery became a shared reality, and his responsibility, which had seemed a solitary burden, now became a mission he was fulfilling in union with the divine plan. He watched the shepherds bow before the child, and felt the depth of a moment that the world outside was completely ignoring. That moment of glory and reverence with the visit of the wise men was soon replaced by a sense of imminent danger. The questions the Magi asked in Jerusalem about the new king did not go unnoticed by Herod, the cruel and paranoid king who saw in any promise of royalty a threat to his power. The news that they had found the child in Bethlehem spread like a shadow. Joseph felt a growing weight in his chest, an instinct of alert that did not abandon him. The mystery he protected was now in the sights of a brutal human power. His mission as an invisible shield became something much more literal, and the heart of the righteous man, which had been filled with peace, now filled with a silent but real fear for the son he had accepted as his own. He knew that God's plan was not to be lived peacefully, but with constant vigilance. And it was in this climate of danger that the voice of the angel returned in His dream, it was not a whisper of comfort, but an urgent command, a voice that left no room for doubts or hesitations. Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt. The message was clear and terrifying. Jesus' life was in danger, and the only option was immediate flight to a strange, distant, and unknown land. Joseph woke up in the middle of the night, his body tense, but his mind absolutely focused. There was no questioning, no lament. He simply got up, woke Mary in silence, and began to gather the few things they could take, including the gifts of the Magi, which now seemed to have a practical and providential purpose. They were not just traveling, they were fleeing, leaving behind everything they had: the house, the workshop, the small routine they had built to cast themselves into an unknown desert, trusting in a promise that now seemed as fragile as the life of the child in his arms. Years passed in Egypt, and Joseph's life became an echo of the one he had in Nazareth. He worked, cared for Mary, and taught Jesus the secrets of carpentry, but the heart of the just man was always on watch. The news of the death of Herod the Cruel came as a distant murmur, and for Joseph, it was not a political event, but a light at the end of a dark tunnel. It was the permission, the opportunity to return home. The tension he had carried on his shoulders for so long began to dissipate, and a deep and silent relief filled his spirit. And it was then that the voice of the angel came for the third and last time in his dream, but not with the urgency of before, but with the calm of a job well done. Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. The journey back was long, but fear was no longer their travel companion. It was hope that guided them, the desire to return home. Joseph thought of settling in Judea, perhaps closer to the hustle and bustle of Jerusalem, but a premonition, or perhaps a new warning made him change his route. He heard that Archelaus, Herod's son, ruled there, and the memory of the father's cruelty was enough to guide his steps away. They then proceeded to the familiar, peaceful Nazareth. The return was not festive, not a parade. It was the return of a family of fugitives who blended back into their city, their routine, their invisibility. He picked up his tools, reopened his workshop, and the smell of sawdust and the sound of the hammer became the soundtrack of his life again. The man of faith was back home, but now with the burden and the joy of having protected and raised the most important son of all time. Life in Nazareth took its course, and the years passed with the quiet and predictable cadence of a carpenter's workshop. Joseph taught Jesus, with patience and love, the art of his trade. He showed him how the smell of fresh sawdust mixed with the satisfaction of a job well done, how the precision of a cut could determine the solidity of a piece, and how the strength of the hands, when united with the patience of the soul, could shape the most resistant of woods. The man of few words, but of firm gestures, taught discipline and constancy. His daily labor was his most sincere prayer, and he, the silent father, was the mirror that reflected the humility, dignity, and quiet justice that Jesus would one day carry to the world. Joseph did not teach with sermons or parables, but with the sweat on his brow, with the calluses on his hands, and with the perseverance he demonstrated in every new project. As the boy became a man, Joseph began to realize that his foundational work was completing. Jesus' questions were no longer those of a curious child, but of someone who carried a deep purpose. In his eyes, Joseph saw not only the son he loved, but the wisdom of a God who was ready to walk on his own. There were moments when he watched him in silence and felt a mixture of pride and a gentle sadness. The sadness of a father who knows that his son is about to leave for his mission. The invisible shield he had been for so many years was no longer a necessity. The foundation was solid, the base was firm, and Jesus' humanity had been forged in the simplicity of a life of work and obedience. The greatness of Joseph's life was not measured in glory, but in invisibility, and his greatest work was ready to be revealed to the world. Joseph's life, which seemed like a silk thread woven into the tapestry of history, was approaching its end as discreetly as his existence had been. He aged with the dignity of one who lived a life with purpose. The calloused hands, which had shaped the wood to sustain the world, now rested in his lap, tired but satisfied. There was no regret, no sense of an unfinished job. In his heart, he felt the deep peace of a man who had fulfilled his mission. He knew that the son he had raised was not just his, but of a kingdom that was not of this world, and his work of protection and foundation had reached its climax. He did not need applause, monuments, or glory. His greatest reward was the certainty that he had fulfilled his role of having been the earthly father who shaped the humanity of a God. He prepared to leave in silence, in the same way he had arrived. The final moment was as intimate and private as his life. There were no thunderclaps, no choir of angels to take him, just the silence of a house in Nazareth and the presence of Mary and Jesus by his side. His breathing became lighter, softer, until it quieted completely. Joseph's soul departed with the same humility with which he lived, leaving behind the world he had protected and a son he had taught to be a man. The absence of Joseph in Jesus' adult life is not a coincidence, but a profound symbol that his work was complete. The invisible shield had dissolved, and the foundation was so firm that it no longer needed the architect. Jesus' path was now his alone, and the world that awaited him was ready to be transformed, thanks to the silent and invisible foundation that a simple carpenter had built in Nazareth. The account of his life, if it could ever be told, would be that of a man who touched the divine with his calloused hands. He was the guardian of a mystery that few, or perhaps no one, were able to understand. The dream with the angel, the journey to Bethlehem, the visit of the wise men, the flight to Egypt, the life of exile, and the return to Nazareth. All of this happened with a naturalness that made the unbelievable believable. There were no celestial songs that were repeated, there was no angel who followed him throughout his life, and there were no great miracles for his own faith. They were events that simply happened, like rain that comes and goes, and Joseph, the silent protagonist, experienced them without a fuss, without an audience, and without the need to tell his story to the world. He was the most crucial link, but also the most invisible. In the chain of events that would forever change the face of humanity, his life was proof that the greatest faith resides in silent obedience and not in the glory of the spotlights. And so, Joseph's life simply continued. The sound of the hammer on the wood became the only soundtrack of his days. The man who had protected God's promise from the cruel world and the clutches of death now lived a life so peaceful that it seemed all the experience had been just a dream. He did not need sermons, Because his own life was won. He did not need miracles, because the greatest of all he had held in his arms. And his story, which began in a mysterious way, ended abruptly, without a grand finale. It simply stopped. The mystery that touched his life was gone, leaving behind a legacy of faith and obedience that only manifested in his absence. His story is the kind of account that truly happens, that doesn't have a perfect beginning, middle, and end, but leaves you with a question in your heart. And a reverence in your soul. And Joseph the carpenter took the secret of what he lived to the rest of his days, without ever having been able to explain the greatness of the events that happened in his life.